Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today on this New Year's Eve, we'll be looking back at 2025 with guests we were in touch with over the year as major stories evolved, chief among them the increasing power of the Supreme Court. Joining us to examine how John Roberts orchestrated the capture of the Supreme Court by a right-wing oligarchy to perpetuate Republican rule is Lisa Graves, one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the U.S. Supreme Court and other levers of power. She leads True North Research and co-hosts Legal AF and has served as senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article III Judges Division for the U.S. Courts. She's the author of the new book just out, Without Precedent, How Chief Justice Roberts and His Accomplices Rewrote the Constitution and Dismantled Our Rights. And then we'll look into the ongoing war in Ukraine, which we covered as it evolved this year, and speak with Aram Shabanian, a national investigative reporter and the former open source information gathering manager at New Lines Institute. He recently taught in nonproliferation and terrorism studies at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey, where his research focused on the Cold War and contemporary histories of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. He has just returned from Kyiv, and we will discuss the battlefield stalemate and how the Trump administration is pulling back support for the embattled country in favor of a so-called peace deal, which asks nothing of Putin while pressuring Ukraine to make concessions. And before we begin, as this year ends and you can make tax-deductible donations for 2025, I'm hoping you consider backgroundbriefing.org/donate and publictruthmedia.org for your charitable giving, since we produce a daily news analysis program covering the major stories in the news 5 days a week on a very modest budget, and have recently expanded our production team from 2 people, that's me and Graham, to 5 employees as we expand our social media presence and have a new Gen Z reporter to engage the future generation in a coalition of boomers and zoomers out to make America decent and sane again, and the world a better place for all. So happy holidays to you, and the very best in the new year as we expand our fact-based community in post-truth America. And joining us now on this New Year's Eve is Lisa Graves, one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the United States Supreme Court and other levers of power. She leads True North Research and co-hosts Legal AF, and has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article III Judges Division of the U.S. Courts. And she's the author of the new book just out, Without Precedent, How Chief Justice Roberts and His Accomplices Rewrote the Constitution and Dismantled Our Rights. Welcome to Background Briefing, Lisa Graves.
Thank you so much for having me on, Ian.
So on this New Year's Eve, as 2025 comes to an end, I wanted to look back on the big stories of the year, at least 2 of them, one of which, of course, is the Ukraine war. But to my mind, the Supreme Court's growing power and its growing unrepresentativeness, if that's the right word, is a huge story. And it seems as it increases in power, so does its lack of representation for all Americans increase. How do you see it?
I think you're so right, Ian. I think what we've seen with the U.S. Supreme Court this year is that the mask has really fallen, and we've seen how hyper-partisan this Roberts Court is, how willing it is to use the judicial power to aggrandize the power of President Trump, and to do so as a bookend to the terrible decision in 2024 where John Roberts orchestrated immunity from criminal prosecution of Trump. And so this year, the year 2025, has been where I think many more Americans have finally seen how out of control the Roberts Court is and what that means for our freedoms.
And what can we do about this increased power, and particularly giving Trump unlimited power and complete immunity?
Well, this is a situation in which there have been a lot of calls for court reform, and I certainly have helped move those forward. I think after the Dobbs decision in 2022, the immunity decision in 2024, and the series of emergency rulings this year where the court has sided with Trump over and over again, what that means is that more and more Americans understand that we have to have court reform as part of the effort to restore our rights. There are a lot of proposals on the table. There are things like the expansion of the court, term limits, changes in its jurisdiction, a real meaningful ethics code for the court. But the bottom line is that we have to embrace bold changes in order to undo the damage that this court has been doing to our democracy. It has allowed authoritarian policies to barrel in the door. And with few exceptions, it has really been in the tank for Trump over these past 2 years. It not only paved the way for Trump's return to power, once he came back into power, it increased his power to a point that no other president has had in our lifetimes, if ever.
So can we all kind of boycott it in a way, or just not take it seriously because it has lost its credibility? Is there any way for a kind of citizens boycott? I don't know that it would affect them because they've got power and they're there for a lifetime. And they clearly, people like Alito and Thomas are clearly contemptuous of average people since they spend all their time hanging out with billionaires. So I don't think, you can name and shame them. But I'm just wondering, is there any way for them to find out that the public no longer takes them seriously as jurists, but sees them as political operatives?
Well, first of all, I think what we're seeing in the polling, and that's been since 2022 and again this year, the Supreme Court is polling at the worst level it has in its history, the history of polling about public confidence in the court. And so the public already understands that this court is not really doing justice, that it's not acting like a fair court. And that's actually sort of the lemonade of the situation, that people understand that we're going to have court reform. I do think that what we're also seeing is that not just the public, but a lot of other judges recognize that this court is not behaving like a court. It's behaving like an arm of Trump, like a MAGA arm, using the judicial power in ways that have not been seen, really, that we've never seen, where a court has just been bent on overturning precedent after precedent to advance a pretty extreme agenda, one that is really at odds with the interests of the American people. And so we have to take our power back. Many, many years ago, Abraham Lincoln spoke about his fears about the power of a court growing too powerful for its role, and that was with respect to the Roger Taney court, the court that issued the terrible Dred Scott decision. And what Abraham Lincoln said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, is that if the people concede that the court has the final say on all these matters of public policy, that people will cease to be their own rulers. We will cease to have self-government. And so, what we've seen this court do and what it's poised to do coming into 2026 is to really try to mute the effect of the Civil War amendments, the amendments that came out of that Civil War, the 14th and 15th Amendments, by changing the rules regarding voting to make it harder for Americans to vote, and also to allow these white Southern legislatures to bleach out congressional representation for Black Americans. And we are going to have to rebuke that court. We're going to have to take that decision that's about to come out this coming year in the Calais case, and we have to treat it as the illegitimate decision that it is, and as an illegitimate edict that is at odds with our Constitution and with the Civil Rights Amendment for the Voting Rights Act, and more. And so it's really up to us, even though it seems like that it's hard to sort of, how does that work in reality? But the reality is that we are going to have to build power. We're going to have to use those decisions to build more power to fuel the fire for reform.
So if Roberts goes ahead, as many expects, and gets rid of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that will mean that there will be no Black legislators in the South on the Democratic side. And that includes Benny Thompson, who was co-chair of the January 6th committee. So in effect, we'd be going back to Jim Crow, wouldn't we?
Well, that's right. This decision that's to come, which is really forecasted in a way by what the court did under the emergency docket in Texas, and allowing the maps in Texas for the 5 seats that Trump demanded go forward, even though the lower courts found that they were based on racial considerations and were designed in part to remove Black legislators. If the Roberts Court, in essence, succeeds in this round of rolling the clock backward, the clock would be rolled backward to that Jim Crow era where Blacks were basically pushed out of elective office. When you look at the history since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, what you see is this enormous diversity in our state legislatures where people really have had greater representation. And that's, in some ways exactly what it seems that the Roberts Court is so hostile to. And that's why it really is a MAGA court, even though 3 of the 6 justices were put on the court by Donald Trump. The fact is that this mindset is very MAGA. This mindset of basically what constitutes white supremacy, with the complicity of Clarence Thomas, who was really chosen by C. Boyd and Gray and by the right-wing machine to turn back the gains that Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP fought for years to secure in the law. And so I do think of this as a rollback to the late 1800s and early 1900s, to the Robert Barron era, to that Jim Crow era in some ways, in terms of representation. And I can tell you, Ian, I don't think that people are going to stand for it. I think it is going to cement the fact that this court must be reformed, that we need term limits as soon as possible to remove justices from that court, and that we need to make sure the court is doing its proper role and not doing the bidding of any political party, and in particular, as we've seen, not doing the bidding of the Republican Party or really the Trump Party, which is so determined to crush the diversity that really has strengthened America and made our country thrive.
Well, the result of getting rid of all of the Black legislators in the South that are on the Democratic side will be that the Republicans will essentially pick up 13 seats before one vote is cast. So it's going to be pretty significant, because obviously with all the gerrymandering that's happened, and the Supreme Court has allowed gerrymandering or done nothing about it, it would seem that the Democrats, even though there's an expectation that there'll be a blue wave next November, or starting tomorrow, November, that it's an increasingly heavy lift what Roberts is doing to the Democrats, and that leads you to question whether or not that's his whole agenda, is in effect, at the end of the day, to have a one-party state, a permanent Republican rule. We'll be like Putin's Russia, where we'll have elections, but they won't really count.
Well, it's very worrisome because John Roberts has been playing a long game, a chess game, to rewrite the Voting Rights Act, to neuter it, to limit its protections for Americans' right to vote, and now to basically undo protections against diluting the Black vote. And that was what I've been calling pre-rigging the election, or rigging the election. It's astonishing to see a court, a judicial body, act in this extremely partisan way. It knows that Donald Trump has sought these mid-decade map drawing in order to protect himself from any accountability by Congress, investigations, or even legislation that he might have to actually negotiate about with Congress, let alone the possibility of impeachment of him or members of his cabinet, and investigations. And so it's really actually unconscionable for the Roberts Court to be playing this role in putting its thumb, and indeed its fist, on the scale of justice in ways that it knows would help insulate Donald Trump. But that's exactly what the Roberts Court did in giving Donald Trump immunity in the first place, unprecedented counter-constitutional immunity in that decision in 2024, and then the series of decisions in 2025 in which it expanded presidential power. So we are at grave risk in our democracy, not just from Donald Trump and his authoritarian impulses, but from this Supreme Court. I do take, solace in the fact that in a number of elections in this past year, we've seen enormous turnout, even in districts that went for Trump in the 2024 election. And so I think it's certainly possible that people organizing can come together to create sort of a firewall against this. And in fact, when you look at Trump's polling coming into the end of 2025, what you see is how the bottom has fallen out for him for everyone except for the MAGA Republicans, a majority of the Republican Party. He's, pulling in the bottom with Democrats and with independents. And that polling, even though it seems like how could it possibly not be below 30%, that 30% is what reflects the Republican Party that remains aligned to him. But he's seen weakness there as well, in part because of his extreme policies and in part because of the continuing scandal involving Jeffrey Epstein and the Trump administration's efforts to hide more files relating to that despicable pedophile. And I'm referring to Epstein, but also files that clearly mention Trump or may have photos of him or other material that the public has a right to know about this man who for years was best friends with Jeffrey Epstein. And so he is not as invulnerable as he looks. And we have a lot of work to do together in the months ahead in order to try to begin to build the coalition to restore our rights and to reform this Supreme Court.
Well, Trump got mad at Marjorie Taylor Greene for voting in for the discharge petition that brought about the release of the Epstein files, even though Bondi is slow walking it and redacting it like crazy. He said it on camera that he doesn't want the Epstein files released because they're going to hurt a lot of people. Well, the people he's talking about, the ones that rape these young girls, these underage kids. I mean, that's who's being protected, isn't it? And that's who Mikey Johnson's been protecting.
Well, when to hear Trump say that he's, distressed for poor Prince Andrew or former Prince Andrew, I'm not distressed for him at all. I'm distressed for the women who in their youth were assailed by this predator, Jeffrey Epstein, who were recruited by his fellow sexual abuser, Ghislaine Maxwell, who were part of this whole scheme that apparently so many rich and powerful men were part of victimizing. And the fact that Donald Trump is expressing his concern for the predators is, it's revealing in and of itself, right? But the fact is that the American people, including some Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others, can see what is happening, which is it is the crime and it is the cover-up. It's not just the cover-up, but there is a cover-up going on by this administration to hide what's in those files that, involves Donald Trump. And we can see it in the first 2 rounds of releases of the files and the extensive redactions that go beyond anything necessary to protect the survivors who have come forward themselves and said they want these files released. This Justice Department run by Donald Trump, the operation run by Donald Trump, is not focused on the interests of those survivors. It apparently is focused on the interests of Donald Trump, the one man that the people who are in that administration at the top hold their loyalty to more to anyone else or anything else, including our Constitution.
So how do you think the Supreme Court is going to rule on the tariffs case? Because the law is so crystal clear on that. There's just no way in the world that they can rule in favor of Trump. But maybe they will. And if they do, that would be, as bad, if not worse, than striking down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, wouldn't it? Because it'd be so ridiculously flagrant.
Well, I think the immunity decision is another case where this court has just invented things in the Constitution that aren't there. And so I don't trust it at all to do the right thing. However, there are a few instances in which Roberts has broken with the Republican Party, rare instances like with the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. And those are instances in which the business community, and in that case, a lot of the business community supported the ACA despite the partisan attacks on those measures, because so many people really actually need access to healthcare. So this could be another instance where Roberts decides to claim to honor the words of the Constitution, even though he has disregarded it numerous times, but doing so because the business community cannot tolerate this level of chaos from Trump. The principle, obviously, in the Constitution is that this is not a power that any one person should hold. It needs to be a power that is used through the deliberative process of Congress. So we don't have the kind of erratic nonsense that Trump has put forward in his tariff policy, or what appear to be shakedowns, where people are basically asked to kiss his ring or provide him, some sort of favorable treatment or fawning. That's not how the tariff power is supposed to work, but that's how it's working under Trump. And the court may say no. But let me just say this, Ian, even if the court stands up to Trump one or two times, it is doing nothing to undo the damage it has already done to our democratic process through the voting rights decisions, through the Citizens United decision, and through that immunity decision, which John Roberts larded with additional opining, trying to place the pardon power beyond any reach of review by the courts or by Congress. And we've seen what has happened there as well, which is what appears to be the corrupt and certainly the morally corrupt use of the pardon power, but seemingly the politically corrupt use of that power as well by Trump.
But I'm surprised that the party of law and order, the Republicans, don't recognize what a lawless criminal Trump is. I mean, I believe he's also a traitor, but, we don't need to have a conversation about that. But the fact that he's freeing all of these horrible crooks, including one of the world's biggest cocaine drug dealers in history, who imported 500 tons of cocaine into this country and joked about it to his crooked brother, saying we're going to shove it up the noses of the Yankees. And Trump just pardoned this guy. And these hedge fund crooks who ripped off 10,000 American investors, Trump could care less about them. He pardoned this guy. And I don't know whether he's getting kickbacks. I think if you want a pardon, write a letter to Donald Trump and enclose a check. I mean, that's the only explanation. Doesn't this really damage the law in it writ large, in the broader sense? You've got a lackey and an assistant lackey at the Department of Justice as the head attorney general and the deputy attorney general. They don't seem to care about the law. They only care about pleasing this lawless character who's pardoning crooks right, left, and center, including the guy that ran the Silk Road.
Yeah, one of the first pardons. Exactly.
So again, that guy did so much damage because it gave the criminal underworld, a conduit for their criminality. Why did he pardon that guy? Did some money change hands? I mean, this guy is so corrupt and criminal. I know he's tutored by Roy Cohn, who was the mob lawyer. But it just surprises me and continues to surprise me why people don't recognize how lawless he is, and what damage he's doing to the rule of law.
Well, the pardons are so despicable. Quite frankly, I mean, the pardon of the former, president of a country who was convicted of that, basically directing the importation of that 500 or 400 tons of cocaine in the United States. Pardon of Ulbricht, the guy who was using the dark web to facilitate all sorts of illegal trafficking in drugs and other things.
Including assassination, by the way.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, if someone were to come to Hollywood and propose a script in which a president behaved this way, no one would believe it. And yet somehow there's a subset of the American population that continues to believe what this guy is selling. Most people, I think, don't. And they recognize how destructive his actions are to the rule of law. His pardons of everyone involved in the January 6th insurrection, no matter what they were convicted of, no matter their record of violence, it is appalling. And over again, we're seeing this. And yet if this is happening in the same universe in which Donald Trump has claimed to be a rule of law, president, and in which Donald Trump has claimed that he has to take action against Venezuela because of drug trafficking, while he has freed people who've been instrumental in massive drug trafficking. I just wonder how much more we'll see before the house of cards finally falls in on him, because I don't know. It seems to me there's some old cowboy saying like, "Don't put on my shoes and tell me it's raining." But, more and more people have got to wake up to what's happening here, which is that we have someone in the White House who has no devotion to the rule of law. And in part, he's been emboldened by a court that has said that he cannot be held criminally responsible for any official act. That combination, I don't think the founders of the Constitution ever anticipated, but we are facing a genuine crisis in American democracy. We're facing, as you pointed out many times as well, Ian, a real crisis in American foreign policy, in Americans' reputation in the world, as Donald Trump has gone out of his way to basically implement Putin's foreign policy for the United States. Donald Trump has trashed America's reputation in our hemisphere and abroad. He allowed Elon Musk to cut off aid to African nations, to starving kids, and more. He is on a sort of a kind of rampage that has literally undermined all of the good things America has stood for and attempted to keep its promises about. And I think eventually those chickens are going to come home to roost, because this act cannot be sustained forever, and the American people are growing tired of it. How we'll be able to take back power, given the role the Roberts Court is playing in trying to rig the election in 2026 in Donald Trump's favor, we'll see. But the fact is that we can't give up and we can't give in.
Well, the Honduran former president, he was sentenced for 54 years in jail, and Trump just sprung him. But guess who was the prosecutor who put him in jail? Emil Bove, for God's sake, one of Trump's lawyers, who's now Trump has appointed him to the appeals court.
Wow. I mean, it is just extraordinary what we've seen. I mean, and, I don't think that I don't think Trump knows that about Bove. I don't think he cares, because his willingness to pardon people, he pardoned one of the guys who's been one of the billionaires who's been instrumental in the rise of Donald Trump's fortune in the crypto arena. And so, everywhere we turn, there's, alliances, business interests, conflicts of interest. There's Trump and the Trump family, the Trump business basically growing in its wealth and power. We already saw in the first Trump administration how Jared Kushner turned himself into a billionaire, basically as Trump's advisor. And so the corruption of this administration is endless. It's bottomless, and it is eroding the rule of law. It basically, in the area of mergers, for example, these businesses in America and abroad, have basically taken a lesson that they have to kiss up to Trump in order to get what they want. That's not actually how business has been done under the U.S. legal system. The U.S. legal system, for most of this modern era, has been one that has been marked by stability and by bribery, or those kind of payoffs, not being a part of the contracting process or the merger process, or anything like that. But now we're seeing Trump try to consolidate power. For example, this move to take over the FTC isn't just about trade. It's about making Donald Trump himself the person who gets to bless your merger or mess it up by enforcing antitrust laws. As Senator Whitehouse and I spoke about a couple of days ago, this is a recipe for rampant corruption, expanding beyond what we've already seen. And the court is complicit in its efforts to expand Trump's power, to allow him to dominate these agencies, to give him that kind of control that is basically the kind of power that no one person should have, and certainly not someone who has shown himself to abuse that power over and over again.
Well, Lisa Graves, we've run out of time on this New Year's Eve, but I thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Ian, for having me on, and Happy New Year. And I am glad to say goodbye to 2025. I'm hoping that we can have a much better 2026.
Well, Happy New Year to you. And again, I've been speaking with Lisa Graves, one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the United States Supreme Court and other levers of power. She leads True North Research and is the co-host of Legal AF, and has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article III Judge Division for the U.S. Courts. And she's the author of the new book just out, Without Precedent, How Chief Justice Roberts and His Accomplices Rewrote the Constitution and Dismantled Our Rights. We're going to take a brief station break and back in a moment, looking into the ongoing war in Ukraine as it evolved this year. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now on this New Year's Eve is Aram Shabanian, a national investigative reporter and the former open source information gathering manager at New Lines Institute. He recently taught in nonproliferation and terrorism studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, where his research focused on the Cold War and the contemporary histories of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and he recently returned from Kyiv. Welcome to Background Briefing, Aram Shabanian.
Thanks for having me on again.
Well, thanks for joining us. And as this year comes to an end, I wanted to look back on Background Briefing's coverage of Russia's war on Ukraine, which has been going on. Obviously, it'll be entering its fourth year in February. So it's been obviously a total disaster for both the victims, Ukraine, and for the victimizers, Russia. And it would seem to me that Putin has to be in trouble, because my understanding is that the oligarchs and whatever other power establishments that exist in that dictatorship, they have every reason to want this war to end, where Putin has every reason to want this war to continue. How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, there's definitely, it's Putin's war, to be sure. I don't know if this war would have happened if Vladimir Putin himself were not in charge of Russia, if it were just, institutional inertia. But there are a number of oligarchs who are at least publicly supportive of the war and not willing to make any statements critical of the war's aims, which could either be, fear for their own well-being for obvious reasons, or it could indicate a larger societal support of the war. I mean, there's going to be frustrations with the number of soldiers who have been lost. We saw that with the Prigozhin rebellion last year or the year before. But again, that rebellion wasn't against the idea of fighting the war. It was against the way the war was being fought. There are a number of oligarchs who believe that Putin isn't doing enough in the war, that Putin should be using larger weapons, should be upgrading to potentially chemical or nuclear weapons to use those on the battlefield to defeat Ukraine. Whereas there are also definitely oligarchs who would much rather go back to business as usual and go back to raking in the money. It's really kind of hard to say at this point. What I will say is that the Russians lost, between 15 and 18,000 soldiers killed in their occupation of Afghanistan in the 80s, and that alone was a key factor in bringing down the Soviet Union. It was a major event that culminated in the breakup of the Soviet Union. The hundreds of thousands of soldiers the Russians have lost in this war will absolutely play a role in Russia's future and in Putin's future. What remains to be seen is how far into the future that role will come.
But what is really going on at the front? Because you get these continual stories particularly from people like J.D. Vance, who just keep repeating the idea that Russia's a much bigger country than Ukraine, therefore they're going to win. And you hear that all the time. They've got more manpower, they can outlast the Ukrainians, etc. But the recent victories that the Russians are claiming, apparently they're not quite as advertised. And it seems that given the incredible amount of casualties of killed and wounded, up to 1 million, that they've lost probably their professional soldiers, have they not? They've been using kids from the provinces, and I'm not sure how much they haven't really gone after the privileged kids in the cities. They've got North Koreans, and they've conned people from all kinds of countries, South Africa and Nepal, etc. And they're starting to, want to get out. I just want to get from you, if we can, a sense of we know that the Ukrainians have to be exhausted, I don't know whether you've seen the documentary 2,000 meters to Andravika. Have you seen that at all?
I have, yes.
It's really devastating, don't you think? I mean,
I think, yeah, it's, as a side note, everybody listening should go watch this documentary. It's available on YouTube if you're in the US. It's in 4K, and it's probably the most clear and truthful war documentary I have ever seen in my life. I mean, it does not, they don't have to tell you war is bad and not enjoyable to get that point across in this documentary. And it shows just, I mean, it shows, the documentary itself is about the battle to advance on Andrivka. They have to advance through these farm fields, but the farm fields are covered with thousands and thousands of landmines. The only way through the farm fields is this narrow strip of forest, roughly the width of a U.S. interstate. And you see just how close quarters this fight is, but also how a lot of it is done with drones. A lot of it looks like a team video game, almost like a real-time strategy game, but each player controls one type of unit on the battlefield is kind of the vibe that you get. So you see how mechanized and technologically advanced the war is, but then you also see very real human emotions, and those emotions, I think, tell more of a story than the technology. There's one scene in particular where a Ukrainian soldier stands up and starts firing wildly from the hip, shouting, swear words and that, you killed my family, you destroyed my house in Bucha, how dare you? Why did you come here? Why did you have to come here to die? Why don't you go home? That hatred is not going away. And so whatever Putin may think he's doing behind the scenes, whatever Russian society thinks it may be getting out of this behind the scenes, what they've done is they've made a permanent foe on their border, one which will not demilitarize after the war, one which will remain a military powerhouse for all of Europe, and one which will remain a threat to the Russians for the foreseeable future, unless the Russians make a meaningful change and negotiate with the Ukrainians, and give their land back. And so that's really what we're seeing here, and that's what the documentary really shows is just the evolution in the war, but also in the level of hatred that you see on the battlefield.
But Trump seems to just want to, give everything to Putin, ask nothing of him, but pressure concessions out of Ukraine. And they're already cut off. They haven't cut off intel, but they've cut off arms, have they not? Which is pretty drastic, and I'm not sure the Europeans can fill the breach here.
Yeah, I'm not sure so they keep talking about cutting off arms, and then arms will continue to arrive. I think there's a lot of behind the scenes work being done by folks at the Department of Defense and whatnot, where Trump will announce, okay, we're not going to send weapons anymore, and somebody at DoD interprets that as, okay, no more new weapons, but whatever was on the way keeps going, that kind of thing. Yeah. I think there's been some degree of that's kind of made it difficult for the Trump administration to have blanket decisions made. But I also think that, and we talked about this about a year ago, and something I said back then was that Trump is going to try to be buddy-buddy with Putin, and he's going to try to negotiate some kind of a deal with Putin, right? And he wants to walk away and say that he's made peace. The problem is Putin is not agreeing to any deal that Trump can save any face with. And Putin continues to slap Trump every opportunity he gets because Putin is using Trump. They're not buddies. Putin is using Trump as long as he's useful, and then he's going to throw him to the curb. Trump hasn't understood that yet. And when he does come to understand that, that will be a very dangerous time for our countries. Because at that point, we'll have to see, will Trump take the fight to the Russians, or will he, kind of eat crow and look bad in front of Putin? I think it will be the former, not the latter.
But also, Putin doesn't seem to have any real interest in ending this war, at least with any compromise, completely on his terms, and he gets everything that he wants. And I just don't understand why Trump doesn't know that, and why Jared Kushner and Witkoff don't seem to know that.
Well, I think part of the problem is that the Trump administration is getting information on the war and the background to the war from I'll call them disingenuous sources at best. But one of the key sources is a man named David Sachs, who is, a millionaire from Silicon Valley, who is very close with Elon Musk and very close with Donald Trump now. He's currently the AI czar, I think, for the administration.
Yeah, the cryptos are as well.
Crypto czar, that's what he is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but David Sachs is an adherent to the ideology of John Mearsheimer, who believes in these spheres of influence type things, where the big countries control things that are happening around them. And I think that we're seeing the Mearsheimer influence bleed into America's foreign policy at this point, where we're seeing Marco Rubio getting on stage and talking about how the US doesn't want to support Ukraine because that's not our war, it's on another continent. And then minutes later, the administration talks about its plans to attack Venezuela, which notably is also not on the same continent as the United States. And so I think what we're seeing is that the US is trying to readjust to control its sphere of influence in the Americas and kind of let the Russians run Eastern Europe. The problem with that is that Putin isn't interested in kind of having dominance over Eastern Europe, like sway or imperial power in that way. In that sense, I think the problem that the administration is having is that they're not understanding Putin's war is, in his eyes, existential against Ukraine. That is to say, as long as there's a viable Ukrainian democracy on Russia's border, Ukraine is an existential threat to Vladimir Putin's regime. Because if the Ukrainian people can have a Maidan and overthrow their oligarchs and then elect somebody like Zelensky, who actually stands for them and seems to represent them, then so too can the Belarusian and Russian people do that. And that, of course, is a threat to Putin. The Trump administration doesn't get that. They are surrounded by people who have not seen a war like this in a long time or ever, where the aim is not material. It's not, we want to say where your oil goes or we want to control your foreign policy, that kind of thing. The aim here is explicit domination of the Ukrainian people and the erasure of the Ukrainian culture and nation. Because of that, there's a mismatch between the US administration and Putin's regime. Because I think fundamentally the Trump administration does not or cannot understand that that's the war aim.
So, do you think then that the Ukrainians can wait out Putin? Putin seems to be waiting them out, at least that's what he thinks. And that's what his supporters over here seem to think, that he's got the bigger country and his time is on his side. I just was wondering, when we mentioned 2,000 meters to Androvika, the point I was trying to make then is that, the Ukrainians have been at this for almost 4 years. They've obviously taken casualties. We saw in the documentary how many casualties they took just to this small unit. So, and then there are reports now that thousands of young Ukrainians are trying to escape the country, escape the draft, etc. What is the situation and who's got the staying power here? Because, as we were saying earlier, I'm not sure that the Russians who are claiming victory are actually doing as well as they think they are. But on the other hand, we just don't know how strong the Ukrainian lines are.
Right. And it is absolutely a problem for the Ukrainians because the Russians, to as an example, there's a lot of talk about Russian human wave tactics on the Eastern Front. And they're not human wave assaults. Human wave implies, hundreds or thousands of men advancing at once with rifles or machine guns and falling by the dozens. That's not what the Russians are doing. What the Russians are doing is they'll send 20 to 50 men at once at a Ukrainian position, and when that position opens fire on the Russians, they then level that position with artillery. In the process, losing many of their own men as basically human scouts, where you would use a reconnaissance drone on the Ukrainian side. So what we're seeing is the Russians have less desire to keep their soldiers alive, which gives them a bit of an advantage here. They have they're a lot more likely to throw their soldiers away, especially some of these conscripts or convict soldiers that they've drafted. They're a lot more likely to throw their lives away than the Ukrainians, who need to save as many lives as they can and need to keep as many of their personnel alive as they can. Because one, Ukraine has a smaller pool to draw from to begin with. Two, Ukraine needs to be seen not losing the war visibly, so their allies will keep supporting them. But three, Ukraine is a democracy and Russia is not. And so that both builds in a weakness to Ukraine where the government in power can't have too many losses, but also a bit of flexibility that the Russians don't have, where if Ukraine's leadership does really poorly and the people vote them out, the people have kind of taken on the guilt of the war, or the course of the war, in a way there, at least unconsciously, in a way that the Russian people cannot, because they're being forced to go to war, right? And so it adds and subtracts from each side. What I will say is that when I was in Kyiv, one of the things that I walked away with that was most profound, shocking, and overall upsetting was the low number of young men and men my age that I saw just in general. I saw a lot of soldiers. I saw probably more soldiers than I saw, college age men. Um, I saw a lot of young women and a lot of older men, a lot of, boys, and then a lot of injured men, but not a lot of able-bodied men my age, which shows that a lot of people are either out of the country or in the military in some way fighting. Um, it's of course important to remember that the size of your army is not everything. And I think the closest analog, and I've mentioned this before, for this current war is the Iran-Iraq war, where we had the Iraqi side, which would be roughly akin to the Ukrainian side, not in terms of guilt or whatever, but in terms of military capabilities. The Iraqi side, which was heavily technologically advanced and more elite than the Iranian side, versus the Iranians, who could call upon thousands and thousands of men to run into the battlefield, uh, with based on ideological fervor or something else. I think the underlying theme here is key for both wars, is that the Iran-Iraq war really started to end when the West didn't want to support Iraq anymore and made it clear to Iran that they would not tolerate further actions. That's when the war came to an end, with a ceasefire and a stalemate, and basically the border returning to where it was pre-war. I think something similar might happen in Ukraine eventually, where the West stands up and lets the Russians know, like, no, we're not letting you advance further. We're not getting directly involved in the war yet, wink, wink, which is kind of what happened with Iran. But at the same time, the West will grow tired of supporting Ukraine and throwing money to Ukraine, because I think a lot of conservative folks in the West think that Ukraine is just outright losing this war, or is corrupt and spending their money wrongfully, when the reality is that a lot of these first of all, we're not sending all that much money. We're mostly sending equipment, and a lot of the money that we're sending does get spent in the U.S. And I understand that that sounds like a cycle for the military-industrial complex to a lot of people, but we need to remember, for instance, that the Abrams tanks that have been talked about being sent to Ukraine, these are M1 and M1A1 standard Abrams tanks, which can never be upgraded to the Army's current M1A2 or M1A3 standards. Or I'm sorry, M1A2 and M1A2 SCP 1, 2, and 3 standards. The M1A1 cannot be upgraded to those levels. So these tanks have the option of rotting in the desert. We can scrap them, but it'll probably cost about as much as it did to build them to scrap them, because of the components they're made of. We can give them to the Saudis, or we can let them gallivant through Eastern Europe, protecting the people of Europe from a hostile threat. I think most Americans would agree that if we're going to give these weapons to anybody around the world, it should be to a country that's actually defending itself. And so I think that a lot of the problem has been the messaging that we see in the US in terms of communicating to Americans why they need to support the Ukrainians. Whereas the Russians don't have to worry about the messaging as much, right? The Ukrainian side and the American side supporting the Ukrainians, we have to worry about messaging just by nature of the way that our societies are set up. That gives the Russians an advantage, but it also gives them a significant disadvantage, in that we won't know how much pressure is building against Putin's tactics until it bursts, right? Whereas in the West, we can see this pressure building. We have like a valve on it. With Russia, it's going to blow at some point. We don't know when, if it'll be after the war or during the war, but it will blow at some point, and there will be repercussions.
Well, Aaron Shabanian, let's go back to the Biden era when the war started. I mean, I think Biden and Sullivan and Blinken were a catastrophe. I mean, they had no strategy except to apparently bleed the Russians, but they kept holding back stuff that the Ukrainians were begging for, and then dithering around, and then eventually sending the stuff way too late. They talked them into a counteroffensive that's shown in that documentary, 2,000 meters to Androvika. In October 2022, the Russians were on their back foot. That was a moment when the Ukrainians, if they had the proper support, could have rolled the Russians back, and Biden and company were conned into believing and tricked into believing by the Russians that they were about to launch tactical nuclear weapons, which is just a game that Putin was playing. And so, we set all these red lines and then eventually allowed them to be crossed and, self-deterred ourselves, and then generally screwed the whole thing up without, a real strategy, and added to the agony of this almost 4-year-long war. I'm imagining, you were just in Ukraine. I imagine the Ukrainian people, they've got their hands full, but they must be looking back at Biden that he's not much better than Trump.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of frustration in Ukraine and for myself with the Biden administration's tactics. And I want to caveat that what I'm about to say is not my personal opinion, and I don't agree with it, but I believe it to be the stance of the Biden administration, which I believe looked at the situation, looked at Russia's nuclear threats and Russia's nuclear arsenal, and told themselves, okay, even if it's a 0.5% chance that Putin makes good on these threats if we cross a certain line, that's a 0.5% chance that we can't take with the American people who ultimately elected us versus the Ukrainian people who are not in the United States. Now, where I would disagree with that is the idea that kicking the ball down the road does us any good here in the U.S. either. I think that the best bet would have been to stand up to the Russians at the get-go. In fact, before the get-go. The problem with that is the way that history would look at it. Now, we can look at the war and say that obviously Russia was going to launch its invasion of Ukraine. But if the U.S. had deployed thousands of troops to Poland or had sent fighter jets to protect the skies of Kyiv in January 2022, the war might not have launched when it did, and the historical record could be warmongers in America under Joe Biden threaten Russia with war, forcing Russia to attack Ukraine in defense, right? I think that's what was going through their heads. And in the end, the salami tactics of slowly increasing the potency of the weapons that we're sending has been effective in diminishing Russia's propaganda in the sense that they can't call out all these weapon systems at once. But I think the very fact that Russia has continually said the red line for nuclear weapons will be if you send offensive weapons to Ukraine, and then we do that and nothing happens. Okay, now if you send tanks, it's the red line. We do that, nothing happens, right? Fighter jets, nothing happens. That betrays the reality, which is that the Biden administration was afraid of nuclear threats that were not likely to be acted on, provided the U.S. acted within certain bounds, right? If there were U.S. Marines fighting in Donetsk, yeah, that would probably be a bit of a red line for the Russians. But if on February 24th, 2022, if the U.S. and all of its allies had said, okay, stores open, Ukraine, whenever you want to buy, short of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, you got it. You can have whatever you need. That I think would have both heightened tensions at the beginning, but also shown the Russians at the get-go that, like, you can't accomplish this fight. You're going to have to try a different tactic. Maybe you can hold on to Crimea at this point and use it as a negotiating chip. But I think the way that, yeah, the Biden administration handled this just kind of let people down in the U.S. and in Ukraine, but it also let his own party down. Instead of having this one foreign policy victory that he could have called on during election time, he could have said, yeah, Afghanistan went poorly, and yeah, all these other things are going wrong, but look, Ukraine has all their territory back because of my actions. But he didn't. He did what politicians in the U.S. have done for the last 40 years, which is look for the safest method, the safest pathway, and the safe pathway is not always the best pathway, unfortunately.
Well, the Ukrainians have paid the price, that's for sure. And of course, I don't want to dump on Biden and let Trump off the hook, because he honestly, he's so thoroughly amoral. He doesn't seem to understand who the victim is here. And he treats it like a real estate deal. It's all about territory and about power and money, and we don't even know what kind of deals that are going on between the Russians and their sovereign wealth fund and Witkoff and Jared Kushner. So and the idea that Trump wants to take the frozen Russian funds, which the Belgian Prime Minister seems to be holding up. He wants to take those funds, put them into a fund that he controls and invest in Russia. I mean, he's just unbelievable in not understanding that Russia attacked this country. They're destroying it before our eyes and killing people, civilians. And this is deeply wrong. And this is not how the world should run. And this is why the United Nations was formed after World War II. You know, its principal foundational document was that countries can't invade other countries. Of course, we did that in Iraq, which certainly did not set a good example.
Right. And I think that, the Iraq War must be stated for the record. Without the invasion of Iraq, there's probably no invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Just because of the damage the Iraq War did to the international order, it has been long lasting, and we can't overlook that. But to get back to the war in Ukraine, I think what's important for people to remember at home, listening to this, and what I wish I could convey to the Trump administration, and would gladly convey to them in person without any insults if given the option, is that even if we walk away from this war, even if we force Ukraine to capitulate, this war will not be over until the Ukrainian democracy is destroyed, like I was saying earlier. And that can't be done unless there's a yes man in Kyiv who is suppressing the people, or Russian generals running Kyiv. What that means is that the war will continue in some way, no matter what the U.S. wants. The Ukrainians are not going to capitulate to Russia, and Russia's not going to stop until they control the whole country. Eventually, the war will come down to, even if the U.S. walks away, Poland especially, supplying the Ukrainian insurgents or the Ukrainian military with weapons. Those weapons will flow across the Polish border like water. And let's say the Russians hold all of Ukraine up to the Dnieper, or they hold all of Ukraine, up to Kyiv. They hold, Dnieper and Kyiv, but not the western part of the country. The Russians will eventually move to strike these arms convoys that are coming into the country, either in Poland or at the Polish border. And eventually that will slide us into war between Russia and Poland, which is a NATO member. The alternative to fighting, to Ukraine fighting the Russians to a defeat, is not peace. The alternative to the Ukrainians fighting the Russians off is NATO having to fight the Russians, after the Russians can claim the victory of having fought the entire world and Ukraine and won, which will do a ton to their morale and propaganda at home.
Well, I thank you for joining us here today, Aram, on this New Year's Eve, to look back at this terrible war that Trump says it would never have started if he was president, which of course is an absurdity. But I thank you for your expertise, and I wish you a Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too, Ian. And I just want to say, as we go into the new year, if the listeners out there want to know the one thing they can do to support the Ukrainian people, I would say learn their stories, learn the stories of individual Ukrainians who have suffered from this war. Go online on Facebook. You can find plenty of Ukrainians in Ukraine to talk to become friends with. Share their stories with your fellow Americans, because their stories are the most important thing and the most powerful thing. Americans, conservative or liberal, do have hearts, and they do tend to believe in at least thinking they're doing the right thing. And if you can convince them that the right thing is to support these people in Ukraine who are so much like us and just want a chance at freedom, we have an opportunity to help the war effort.
Well, Aram Shabanian is, of course, a national investigative reporter and the former open source information gathering manager at New Lines Institute. He recently taught in non-proliferation and terrorism studies at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey, where his research focused on the Cold War and contemporary histories of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and he recently returned from Kyiv. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, And our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.